We are kind of strapping in for a journey into one of the longest, bloodiest, and frankly most misunderstood wars in modern African history. That's Eritrea's 1961 to 1991 struggle for independence. Declassified intelligence documents. We're talking CIA reports, Soviet bloc messages, internal State Department memos, the works. Understand how the world powers watched this thing unfold for, 3 decades. See what their most secret intelligence services were predicting, and why Eritrea's eventual win was such a profound, almost frightening moment of historical defiance against the way things were supposed to work.
The world spies saw exactly what was happening on the ground. They often predicted the outcome years, even decades beforehand. Yet the overwhelming feeling you get from these documents is, observation, not salvation.
Forgotten war. It wasn't. It was constantly being watched, dissected, and actually feared by global powers. And the geopolitical fear wasn't just about, regional instability. It was about the precedent it set. I mean, if Eritrea, poorly equipped, facing this massive Soviet-backed Ethiopian military, could actually succeed. Well, it showed a different model of liberation, didn't it? One that was independent. The documents show analysts worrying that success proved independence could happen without debt, without puppet masters, and without seeking permission. And that idea, it scared every superpower used to, pulling the strings.
And the archives really confirmed this deep level of insight, especially from the U.S. side.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We often talk about historical conflicts through, the lens of textbooks, standard narratives. But today, we're doing something a bit different. We are kind of strapping in for a journey into one of the longest, bloodiest, and frankly most misunderstood wars in modern African history. That's Eritrea's 1961 to 1991 struggle for independence against Ethiopia. Now, the history of the war itself, that's pretty well known. But our shortcut to knowledge today isn't hitting the usual public records. No, it's through a really unique stack of source material. Declassified intelligence documents. We're talking CIA reports, Soviet bloc messages, internal State Department memos, the works. So our mission really is to peer behind that curtain. We want to understand how the world powers watched this thing unfold for 3 decades. See what their most secret intelligence services were predicting, and why Eritrea's eventual win was such a profound, almost frightening moment of historical defiance against the way things were supposed to work. Because let's unpack this. The first thing that really jumps out from these files is this stark admission of foresight.
The world spies saw exactly what was happening on the ground. They often predicted the outcome years, even decades beforehand. Yet the overwhelming feeling you get from these documents is, observation, not salvation.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how the documents just completely disprove that idea that this was some, forgotten war. It wasn't. It was constantly being watched, dissected, and actually feared by global powers. You've got the small, annexed region defying a bigger, strategically important empire. And the geopolitical fear wasn't just about, regional instability. It was about the precedent it set. I mean, if Eritrea, poorly equipped, facing this massive Soviet-backed Ethiopian military, could actually succeed. Well, it showed a different model of liberation, didn't it? One that was independent. The documents show analysts worrying that success proved independence could happen without debt, without puppet masters, and without seeking permission. And that idea, it scared every superpower used to, pulling the strings.
And the archives really confirmed this deep level of insight, especially from the U.S. side. We should probably look at that once classified CIA memo from '76, the Ethiopian Revolution and its implications. It's pretty early, right? 15 years before victory. But even then, the memo basically admits Addis Ababa is losing its grip. Can you walk us through what exactly the CIA was seeing back in '76 that made them think that? Because Ethiopia had just overthrown Emperor Haile Selassie. They'd installed the Derg regime, this Marxist military junta. They were supposed to be strong, weren't they?
Supposed to be, yeah. But the internal chaos was just staggering, and the intelligence picked it up perfectly. The Derg, that's the military council running Ethiopia then, was brutally consolidating power inside the country. So the CIA wasn't just tracking troop movements up in Eritrea. They were also tracking famine, economic collapse, the mass executions in Addis Ababa, what they called the Red Terror.
Right.
And that 1976 memo, it stated really clearly that the military leadership was politically fragmented and administratively just incompetent. They were losing control over huge parts of their own territory, not just Eritrea, but down in the Ugandan region too. That internal weakness, the weakness of the Ethiopian state itself, meant the war up north was already kind of slipping away from them.
Okay, that context makes this specific language even more startling.
Right.
Because the document has this remarkable passage. It predicts Eritrea will probably be lost as an integral part of Ethiopia. I mean, they weren't hedging their bets there. They were projecting a pretty certain outcome.
Exactly. And they didn't base that prediction on Eritrean weapon superiority or anything.
Yeah.
No. They analyzed the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF, and they saw a disciplined, ideologically cohesive movement. These weren't just rebels. They were building a sophisticated parallel state structure. They could administer territory they captured, sustain this incredibly long fight. So this foresight, this classified admission, it just confirms that the intelligence agencies knew the final score long before any government said it out loud. The world's eyes were wide open, but the political choice, particularly in the West, was just to watch the inevitable collapse happen.
That CIA foresight it's chilling. But it gets even more complicated when you look at how the Soviets were playing their hand around the same time. Which brings us nicely into those Cold War shadow games, doesn't it? Section 2. So, if the CIA knew Ethiopia was losing, long term, how did the Soviets factor that into their massive commitment to the Darg regime? We see these tables, right? Preserved by the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project, great resource for these old archives. They show messages going back and forth between Moscow and East Berlin.
Yeah, the contradiction there is really profound. You see, the Soviets were eager to replace U.S. influence in the Horn of Africa. That was goal number one. So they started pouring enormous amounts of military hardware. We're talking tanks, fighter jets, artillery into Ethiopia starting in the late 70s. They were basically arming the Derg to the teeth, funding their whole war effort against the Eritreans. However, and this is where those communiques get really interesting, those same Soviet and East German analysts, they were simultaneously and quietly acknowledging the underlying strength, the political maturity even of the Eritrean resistance. So they were essentially betting the entire ideological farm on the Derg while knowing analytically that the Derg was fighting an enemy whose commitment it went beyond normal military math.
Wait a second. If the Soviets knew they were backing a losing horse, why didn't they, hedge their bets? Why not try to reach out to the EPLF, or at least push the Derg towards some kind of concession? Were they really just that locked into the Derg's Marxist ideology?
Well, it wasn't just pure ideology. It was classic Cold War geopolitics. It was about the real estate, the Horn of Africa, stretching from the Red Sea down towards the Sahel, that huge belt south of the Sahara. It's a massive strategic choke point. So the motivation was securing naval routes, controlling access to the Red Sea, projecting power deep into the African continent. The document suggests a calculation, basically, losing Ethiopia as an ideological partner. That was just too high a price to pay, no matter how costly that internal war in Eritrea was. They gambled, really. They gambled that their huge material support would crush the Eritreans before the whole regime just collapsed from the inside out.
So they were playing global chess, focused on securing the board itself.
Yes, exactly. But none of the intelligence models, didn't matter if it was CIA, KGB, East German Stasi, what none of them could accurately calculate was the unique methodology of the Eritrean fighters. Superpowers always measure things like funding, firepower, troop numbers. You see it again and again in the documents. Analysts trying to quantify the EPLF's strength using those metrics and basically failing because these fighters, they were poorly armed, often hungry, facing really advanced Soviet weapons, but they had this profound organizational unity, resilience. They were outlasting empires, not through, superior weapons, but through sheer will, logistical genius, actually, and moral cohesion. That simple factor, the one you can't really quantify, it just rendered the superpowers' complex geopolitical models kind of useless. They couldn't put a price tag on that kind of resistance.
That failure to quantify human will, it leads us straight into this profound irony that comes up in the archives. The irony of all this surveillance and the kind of assistance that came not through action, but through silence. Let's talk about what the declassified archives call Sudan's Gate. There's a CIA brief from the 1980s, Ethiopia, Sudan. Tensions rise over dissident activity, and it lays out a really crucial logistical truth. It basically admitted that Sudan, Ethiopia's neighbor, has long permitted Eritrean insurgents to use its huge, porous territory for logistics, supply routes, sanctuary. The document's careful, though. It describes this not as like formal state sponsorship, but more as geography turned into survival. It calls the fighters refugees of circumstance.
Right, and the core paradox here is absolutely crucial. Sudan's government in Khartoum, they didn't need to actually fund the EPLF or send soldiers. The intelligence notes say they simply had to look the other way. That's it. Just by ignoring the movement of fighters, supplies, refugees across that shared border, Sudan provided this critical logistical shield, a diplomatic one too, in a way. It was exactly what the EPLF needed to survive those massive offensives the Derg kept launching. So in the context of this classified stuff, it becomes really clear that sometimes just indifference, or simple silence. That was maybe the greatest assistance Eritrea ever received.
Yeah.
It just gave them that space to breathe and organize, something no amount of international aid or, formal recognition could have done in that environment.
And then there's the incredible, almost unbelievable irony surrounding Asmara itself, specifically Cagnu Station. This is where the story gets, well, almost cinematic.
Cagnu Station is arguably the most glaring example of the classified world just missing the revolution right under its nose. During the peak of the Cold War, Asmara housed one of the biggest U.S. communication and surveillance bases in Africa, Cagnu Station. It was absolutely enormous.
What was its main job? Exactly. We're talking about those huge antennas, right?
Massive antennas, yeah. Its primary function was high-level global intelligence gathering, SIGINT signals intelligence. It was built specifically to intercept Soviet communications. Listening to every whisper coming out of the Soviet military machine across the Middle East and Africa, it was this huge monument to the U.S. commitment to global surveillance, tracking threats thousands of miles away.
Okay, so you've got the CIA, the NSA, the U.S. military running this incredibly high-tech, massive listening post, monitoring the entire world for enemy signals, physically located in the territory that's fighting for its freedom. But they were somehow simultaneously missing the most revolutionary signal on Earth. Eritrean resolves. Right there.
The irony is just crushing when you look at it through that classified lens. A monumental apparatus of global intelligence focused entirely outward, looking for Soviet troop movements, whatever. Totally blind to the revolutionary forces gathering right outside its gates. The sheer size of the base symbolized global power, yet that power failed to recognize, or maybe chose to ignore, the local struggle for sovereignty happening literally yards away. And when you think about the base finally closing down in the early 1970s, when those huge antennas went silent and the U.S. pulled out, well, the intelligence chatter stopped. And not long after, the actual message of freedom started to replace that cold logic of global politics in Asmara.
So after pulling all this together, synthesizing this whole stack of archives, the CIA's foresight, the Soviet paradox, that Cagnu irony, what does this all mean for the usual story? The narrative often suggests Eritrea triumphed alone. Does it hold up?
That really is the ultimate question these sources raise, isn't it? And we have to be really clear about what alone means here. If alone means without any allies, without logistical support, without anyone even noticing, then the answer from these documents is a definite no. The world was watching. And Sudan offered that crucial, maybe life-saving logistical silence. But if alone means without dependency, without compromising your goals to fit some foreign power's agenda, without submitting to external commands, then the answer is absolutely yes.
So the ultimate finding from these classified archives is really powerful because they confirm this was a victory earned completely on Eritrean terms. The documents basically confirmed the world knew this struggle was unwinnable by ordinary metrics of warfare. They couldn't make the math work, yet Eritrea won anyway. They achieved a victory that no superpower, no foreign donor, no NGO can actually truthfully claim credit for or share.
Exactly. The declassified evidence just rejects any attempt to rewrite independence as some kind of, accident of timing or foreign intrigue. The sources make it crystal clear these fighters were not pawns in some global chess game who just got lucky when the Cold War ended. No, they were the ultimate agents of their own destiny. As the source material kind of suggests, they weren't just pieces on the board. They were the board itself, flipping the pieces that presumed to define them.
So when we synthesize all this, that phrase Eritrea triumphed alone. It isn't just poetry. It's actually historical defiance, and it's backed up by the archives themselves. Because every single declassified page written by the CIA or the KGB that predicted failure based on those conventional power calculations, it's now like certificate of disbelief disproven by victory. It's the truth revealed right there in the archives. International surveillance, but no salvation.
And that, I think, is the enduring power of what they achieved. It confirms that the victory was so total, so profound, it forced even the sealed, classified archives to bow to truth.
Wow, what a phenomenal deep dive into those hidden files. We've really covered some ground, from the CIA's chilling 1976 prediction about the Derg regime failing, to that Soviet paradox arming one side while knowing the other was incredibly strong, all the way to the stunning irony of Cagnu Station just missing the revolution happening right outside its walls. Thank you for helping us synthesize these powerful historical truths that were locked away for so long.
It's crucial work, definitely, bringing these specific details out into the open.
So here is a provocative thought for you, our listener, to maybe mull over. If the world's most sophisticated intelligence networks were watching one of the longest modern wars, but they fundamentally misunderstood the real source of victory,
prioritize an analysis of weapons, money, ideology over things like unity, resilience, sheer will, then what current global movements, the ones that maybe look small or unwinnable today, might we be fundamentally miscalculating right now? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.